My name is Gerald Rouse, and I'm 76 years old. I live alone in a modest adobe-style house on the outskirts of Sedona, Arizona, surrounded by rust-red cliffs, silence, and the stubborn resilience of desert flora. My days are quiet, predictable, colored mostly by the soft grind of habit and the long shadows that stretch over the dry earth as the sun makes its way across the sky. I rise before 6 each morning, not because I have somewhere to be or someone to see, but because the birds start chattering at dawn, and sleep for me has long been a fragile, fleeting thing. I make oatmeal with cinnamon, read a few pages of the same book I've been working through for weeks, and then sit by the window and let the light fill the room while I stare at the empty chair across from me. That chair belonged to Helen, my wife of 48 years, who died nearly 4 years ago after a swift and cruel decline into the grip of cancer. She had been everything soft in this world. A woman who painted wildflowers on postcards and sent them to neighbors just because. After she passed, the house felt too big, yet too full of her. Her shawls still draped over the backs of chairs, her handwriting on sticky notes inside recipe books. Her scent caught forever in the old lavender sachets she kept in her dresser. I left her things untouched, mostly out of reverence, partly out of fear, as if clearing them away would erase the only proof that once this house had laughter in it. My son, Kevin, is my only child. He lives in San Diego now. About a 7-hour drive if the highways are forgiving, but he might as well live on the other side of the ocean. He doesn't call often, and when he does, the conversations are short, efficient, laced with a kind of weary obligation. "How's the weather, Dad? You still getting your prescriptions on time? You eating okay?" I always answer the same way, short, upbeat, rehearsed. I don't tell him that sometimes I forget whether I've eaten lunch or that my left knee has started locking up when I stand too fast. I've learned that the truth only makes people uncomfortable. Kevin wasn't always distant. As a boy, he was curious and intense, always asking questions, tugging on my sleeves during dinner to ask about animals, planets, the way things worked. He used to follow me into my garden out back, helping me plant tomatoes, his little hands getting dirt under the nails, proudly announcing when the first green shoots poked through. He had a sensitive heart, cried when we found a dead bird on the patio, asked to give it a burial under the lemon tree. I raised him the best way I knew how, with steady love and quiet presence. I wasn't always demonstrative, perhaps not as verbally affectionate as Helen was, but I was there, at every school event, every dentist appointment, every heartbreak. After Helen died, I hoped Kevin would draw closer, maybe out of grief, maybe out of the shared bond of missing the same woman who had held our family together. But instead, the gap widened. He visited twice that first year, then once the next, then not at all. When he announced that his wife, Marnie, was expecting, I thought, here it is, the chance to reconnect. A grandchild. A new beginning. I imagined sitting on a bench under the orange tree in the yard, cradling a soft little bundle of life. I imagined teaching her the names of birds, as I had done with Kevin. I imagined having a reason again. But when the baby was born, I didn't get a call right away. I found out via a group email Kevin sent to extended relatives with a photo attached. A pink-cheeked baby named Madeline, swaddled and sleeping. There was no personal message. No, "Dad, meet your granddaughter." Just a caption under the photo. "Everyone's healthy." "We're grateful," I replied immediately, congratulating them, offering to visit when it was convenient. I heard nothing back for 2 weeks, then a short reply from Marnie's account. "Thanks. We're not having visitors just yet." I waited. I sent a card. I called and left a voicemail. I waited some more. Months passed, then nearly a year. I'd see photos of Madeline on social media, posted by Marnie. First smiles, first steps, all the little milestones. I liked every one of them. I wrote little comments, sometimes just emojis. Kevin never acknowledged them. Marnie never replied. I told myself they were busy, overwhelmed, that they would reach out in their own time. I kept imagining the day they'd call and say, "Come visit, Dad. She's asking about you." In the meantime, I stayed quiet. I went to the doctor, refilled my prescriptions, kept my garden neat. I took a watercolor class at the senior center, though I was terrible at it. I read the same books over and over because new ones didn't seem to stick. I started forgetting little things, where I left my reading glasses, whether I had fed the cat, and once I even left the stove on, which scared me enough to unplug the appliance entirely. Still, I didn't tell Kevin. I didn't want to give him another reason to keep me away. Then, one Tuesday morning in June, while I was sweeping the porch, my phone rang. The screen lit up with Kevin's name. My hand trembled as I answered. "Dad," he said, flat, businesslike. "We're coming to Sedona for the weekend. Marnie has a conference. We're bringing Madeline. Would you be able to host us for a couple of days?" I nearly dropped the phone. "Of course," I said too quickly. "Yes, absolutely." "I'd love that just a couple days," he repeated. "We'll get in Friday evening and leave Sunday morning. Marnie has dietary restrictions, and the baby's on a schedule, so we'll probably eat out most of the time. Just wanted to give you a heads up." "Of course," I said again. "Whatever works." "Okay," he said. "We'll see you then." He hung up. I stood there on the porch for a long time, broom in hand, heart thudding against my ribs. After so many months of silence, they were coming. I was finally going to meet my granddaughter. I felt something like sunlight burst open in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Anticipation. Hope. I made a list of groceries to buy, cleaned the guest room, washed the spare set of sheets twice to make sure they smelled fresh. I bought a stuffed elephant, gray, with floppy ears and a stitched smile. I stood in the store holding it longer than I needed to, imagining her tiny hands gripping its trunk. I told myself over and over again that this would be the start of something, that this was the turning point. That family had a way of circling back, like the seasons, even after long winters. I told myself that this time it would be different. Friday arrived cloaked in a kind of nervous electricity that had me waking up before dawn, standing in the kitchen with my coffee, staring blankly out the window as if the sky itself might give me a clue as to how the day would unfold. I had cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing corners I hadn't touched in years, rearranging books on shelves, washing the curtains twice just to ensure they smelled like linen and not like dust and time. I had even set out a few of Helen's favorite decorations. Not for sentimentality, really, but because I thought maybe Marnie would appreciate the tastefulness, the subtle evidence of a feminine touch. The stuffed elephant I had purchased sat on the coffee table, perfectly positioned between a stack of magazines and a bowl of mixed nuts I wasn't sure anyone would eat. I hadn't felt this tense since Helen's surgery. That kind of held-breath tension where everything hangs on how someone walks through your door and whether they smile. By the time their rental car rolled into my driveway just past 6 in the evening, I had changed shirts twice, shaved again even though I'd done it that morning, and practiced saying, "Welcome, so glad you're here" in the mirror like a teenager about to meet a date's parents. The car was one of those sleek, silent models, a black electric sedan that looked completely alien against the dusty gravel of my driveway. I walked out to greet them, heart thudding with a strange mix of joy and apprehension. Kevin stepped out first, sunglasses still on, holding a diaper bag slung over one shoulder. He looked older than I remembered, gray at the temples, a little thinner in the face. Marnie emerged from the passenger side, holding Madeline in her arms, and I instinctively stepped forward, arms opening slightly. "Don't," Kevin said sharply, his voice low but firm. "Let her stay with Marnie for now. She doesn't do well with strangers." The word hit me like a stone to the chest. Stranger. I blinked, nodded, retreated half a step. "Of course," I murmured. "I understand." Madeline, for her part, was quiet, her wide eyes scanning the scene. She had Helen's eyes, that soft, solemn blue. She wore a pale pink hat and a tiny shirt that read, "Little Explorer." She looked at me, unblinking, and for a moment something in me stirred so deep I nearly forgot Kevin's tone. But the moment passed and they were walking past me toward the door. Inside, things felt immediately off. Marnie walked through the rooms as though inspecting a rental property, commenting on the heat, the lighting, the rustic vibe. Kevin checked his phone constantly, already answering emails as he sat on the couch. I offered iced tea, lemonade, water, but they both declined. Madeline was placed in a travel crib Marnie had set up in the corner of the guest room. I stood awkwardly in the hallway, feeling like a bellboy waiting for instructions. "We'll be heading to dinner soon," Marnie said, not looking at me. "There's a vegan place in town that has great reviews. We figured we'd go there directly and not trouble you with cooking." "Of course," I said again. "Whatever you prefer." "I stock the fridge just in case. There's almond milk, oat yogurt." "That's kind, but unnecessary," she cut in gently. I retreated to the kitchen, unsure whether to wait for them or disappear. When they finally left, Madeline stayed behind with me, asleep in the crib. Marnie said, "We'll be back in 2 hours." She shouldn't wake up. If she does, just let her play quietly. Please don't pick her up. She's not used to being held by others. I raised Kevin, I wanted to say, but bit it back. I only nodded. Alone with my granddaughter, I sat on the edge of the armchair across the room, watching her sleep. Her breaths came slow and steady. Her tiny fists curled against her cheeks. I felt like a thief stealing glances at something I wasn't meant to touch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just sat and watched and felt this crushing mix of wonder and sorrow and rage. When they returned, Marnie thanked me politely and took Madeline upstairs. Kevin lingered behind, standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. "Dad," he said, "we appreciate the visit, but we'd like to keep things calm, routine. Madeline needs structure. Just try not to get too close too fast, okay?" I stared at him. My son. My boy. The child I had carried on my shoulders, the one I read to at night until he fell asleep. "You don't have to worry about me," I said slowly. "I won't do anything you don't want." He gave a curt nod. "Good. We've worked really hard to get to this point. I just want to protect that." He went upstairs then, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my untouched pitcher of lemonade and the sound of the ceiling fan clicking like an old metronome. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake thinking of the word stranger and how it had settled into the back of my throat like dust I couldn't cough out. The next morning, I rose early, as usual. The house was still. I made coffee, ate toast, and sat quietly in the sunroom. At some point, I heard soft footsteps from the guest room. Madeline. Awake. I moved slowly, careful not to startle her. She was standing, holding the crib rail, her tiny face peeking over the top. When she saw me, she didn't cry. She didn't retreat. She stared for a moment, then smiled. A wide, dimpled smile that knocked the breath out of me. She reached toward me, little fingers opening and closing in that universal baby gesture of want. I looked toward the hallway. No sound. I stepped closer. "Good morning," I whispered, my voice trembling. Madeline gurgled, a laugh spilling out. She bounced slightly as if trying to climb. I hesitated, unsure, afraid, but then she stretched both arms out fully. I reached in, carefully, slowly, and lifted her. She was lighter than I expected. Warm. Real. She didn't cry. She laid her head against my shoulder and let out a small sigh. We stayed like that for a long time. I carried her to the sunroom, sat down with her in my arms, and showed her the garden through the window. I pointed at the birds, the flowers. She babbled softly. I sang the lullaby I used to sing to Kevin. Her fingers clutched the collar of my shirt. I didn't hear Kevin come down the stairs. I didn't see him enter the room. But I heard his voice, sharp, horrified. "Dad, what are you doing?" I looked up. Kevin stood in the doorway, jaw clenched, eyes wide. "She reached for me," I said. "She wanted—" "I told you not to touch her." "She came to me," I said again, stunned. He crossed the room in 3 steps, arms out. "Give her to me." "Kevin, now." I handed Madeline over, slowly, reluctantly. She whined in protest, squirmed in his arms. Kevin turned away, rocked her. "It's okay," he whispered, not to me. "It's okay, baby." Marnie appeared behind him a moment later. "What happened?" she asked. Kevin didn't answer. He just walked away with Madeline, whispering something I couldn't hear. I stood there alone, hands still warm where her small body had rested. I felt as though I had done something terribly wrong, like I had violated some unspoken law. And yet all I had done was answer the call of a child who had reached for me. That was the moment I understood something had shifted permanently. This was not simply distance or miscommunication. This was something deeper. A suspicion. A boundary drawn not out of caution, but out of conviction. They believed something about me that I didn't yet understand. Something that would change everything. The rest of that morning passed in a haze of tension so thick I could practically feel it pressing against my skin. Kevin didn't speak to me, not in anger, not even in passing. He moved through the house like a man guarding a vault, keeping Madeline close to him, exchanging low, clipped words with Marnie behind closed doors. I tried to make myself invisible. I went to the garden, trimmed the deadheads off the marigolds, watered the tomato vines, wiped down the patio table even though it wasn't dusty. But no matter how many chores I gave myself, I could still feel their presence, or rather their silence, echoing through the house. It was the kind of silence that screamed, the kind that said, "You crossed a line," without ever bothering to name it. Later that afternoon, Marnie approached me while Kevin was upstairs changing Madeline. Her tone was calm, her posture perfectly composed, but her eyes betrayed something else. Fear, maybe, or anger, or worse, suspicion. I know yesterday was emotional, she began, choosing her words like someone picking glass shards out of a carpet. And I know this is all new for you. Grandparenthood. I nodded slowly, unsure what she expected me to say. She was standing near the kitchen island, her hands folded neatly in front of her as if delivering a professional presentation rather than speaking to the man whose son she married. "But Kevin and I have talked about boundaries," she continued, "and one of those boundaries includes physical contact with Madeline." Especially unsupervised, I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to ask what she meant by that, to challenge it outright, but something in her gaze warned me to tread lightly. "She came to me," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "She reached for me." Marnie didn't blink. "She's a baby." Babies reach for shiny objects, pets, electrical cords. It doesn't mean anything that stung, more than I expected. I pressed my hand against the countertop to steady myself. "We're not saying this to be cruel," she added, her voice taking on a polished gentleness that made my skin crawl. "We're just very careful about who Madeline bonds with. We've done a lot of work, Kevin especially, to process things from his own childhood, things that maybe weren't handled." Optimally, I looked up at her, truly startled now. "What things?" She hesitated for half a beat. "Kevin's talked about moments. Gaps. Memories that feel unclear but uncomfortable. We've spoken to professionals about it." "What kind of memories?" I asked, though my voice was already hollow, as if some part of me already understood I would not like the answer. Marnie smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't belong on a face, the kind that looked borrowed from a mask. "That's really for him to share." Not me. She turned then, as if the conversation were over, but I stood there, nailed to the floor, reeling. My mind whirled with 100 fragmented thoughts, memories of Kevin as a child, nothing but laughter and scraped knees, his head resting on my shoulder while I read to him. The idea that he had unearthed some monstrous impression of our shared past felt absurd, offensive, and yet, here we were. My son looked at me like I was dangerous. My daughter-in-law was speaking to me like I was radioactive. And I was starting to understand that their visit was not a bridge. It was an audit, a test. And I had already failed. That night, over dinner, I tried to break the silence. I made my signature roast chicken, the one Helen used to love, with rosemary and garlic rubbed beneath the skin and slices of lemon tucked around the edges of the pan. I set the table with real cloth napkins, even lit candles, though it wasn't yet dark. I thought maybe food could be a peace offering, a return to something familiar. But when they came to the table, Kevin looked at the plate and said flatly, "We don't eat meat anymore." "Oh," I said, "I didn't know. I could make something else." "It's fine," Marnie replied, already opening a container of hummus and setting out sliced cucumbers. "We brought our own food." Just in case, they sat, ate quietly. Madeline was in her high chair, batting at a toy. I tried to engage her, waving a spoon, making silly faces. She giggled and I smiled, warmth blooming in my chest. But then Kevin looked up sharply. "Dad, can you not?" She gets overstimulated easily. I froze mid-gesture. "Sorry," I mumbled. She smiled. Kevin looked back down at his plate without responding. Marnie reached over and adjusted Madeline's bib. Her mouth set in a firm line. After dinner, they excused themselves early, saying Madeline needed to stick to her bedtime schedule. I stayed in the kitchen alone again, scraping chicken into the trash, the lemon slices still fragrant in the pan. I didn't eat much. I sat at the table long after the dishes were done, staring at the stub of a candle until it burned itself out. The next morning, I made pancakes. Not for them, just for me. It was a ritual Helen and I used to do on Sundays. I told myself it would help me feel normal. I was flipping the last one when I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. I turned and saw Madeline wobbling her way into the kitchen, barefoot, her hair a mess of tiny curls. She was alone. I blinked in surprise. No sound from upstairs. "Good morning," I said softly. She toddled toward me without hesitation, babbling nonsense syllables, arms open. I knelt down and she threw herself into my arms. For the second time, she chose me. Not Kevin, not Marnie. Me. And for a moment, I didn't care about their rules. I didn't care about their suspicions or accusations. I held her, and everything in me went still. It didn't last long. Kevin appeared in the doorway not a minute later, face pale with fury. "What did I say?" he barked. "She came to me," I said again, helplessly. "She was alone." "I told you not to touch her," he snapped. Marnie appeared behind him, eyes wide. "How did she get out of the room?" "I don't know," Kevin replied. "But this is exactly what I was afraid of." "What are you accusing me of?" I asked, standing up slowly, still holding Madeline against my chest. She was starting to whimper now, sensing the tension. Kevin stepped forward. "Give her to me." "No," I said, not loudly, not angrily, but firmly. Kevin stopped, stunned. "What did you say?" I said no. "Not until you tell me what's going on. You come into my home, treat me like a stranger, accuse me with vague half-memories, forbid me to touch my granddaughter, and expect me to just nod and apologize? For what?" Kevin's voice cracked. "You think I don't remember? The way you used to shut down. The way you never looked at me after Mom died. The way you touched my shoulder like it was something foreign. I've spent years untangling that. Years in therapy. I was grieving, I said, stunned. I lost your mother, and I didn't know how to be anything other than broken. You were cold, he said. You disappeared, even when you were in the same room. I didn't stop loving you, I whispered. I didn't stop being your father. Madeline was now crying in earnest, so I handed her over, slowly, gently. Kevin took her, rocking her automatically, but his eyes never left mine. They were full of something I couldn't name. Hurt, yes, but also conviction. He believed what he believed, and nothing I said would change that. Marnie stepped forward, placing a hand on Kevin's arm. We should go, she said quietly. They packed quickly. Within the hour they were back in their car, Madeline strapped into her seat, her tear-streaked face peering out the window. I stood on the porch watching them leave, my hands trembling at my sides. No goodbye. No thank you. No promise to call, just the whir of tires on gravel and the shrinking silhouette of the car that held my family, the one that had already decided I didn't belong. After they left, the house collapsed into a silence so dense it felt oppressive, almost animate. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching dust float in the angled morning light, unable to move. The cup of coffee I'd poured sat cooling beside me, untouched, forgotten. Outside, the garden drooped with early heat, bees moving lazily from bloom to bloom. I had expected to feel some version of heartbreak, perhaps something familiar, like sorrow or disappointment. But what I felt was stranger, quieter, and far more unnerving. Disorientation. A rupture, not just between me and my son, but between who I thought I was and who they believed me to be. For hours I sat in the armchair in the sunroom, the same spot where Madeline had nestled against my chest the day before. I could still feel her weight, her warmth, as though her small frame had left a print on my body. That she had reached for me again, not once but twice, felt like more than coincidence. It felt like something sacred, a moment of intuitive connection, one that had been immediately interpreted by my son as dangerous, invasive, suspicious. The fact that Kevin had looked at me with that kind of intensity, so certain, so raw, unsettled me deeply. I kept circling back to the things Marnie had said, the vague references to therapy and unprocessed memories. Kevin had always been an introspective child, sensitive to emotion, but he had never spoken of any trauma, never once alluded to anything, but a quiet, if grieving, household. Had I really been so cold after Helen died? Had I unintentionally wounded him by withdrawing into myself, mistaking silence for strength? Was he carrying bruises I had never seen? I didn't leave the house that day. I didn't answer the phone when the few friends I still had called to check in. I didn't respond to the one-word text Kevin sent that evening, home, nor to the blank-faced emoji Marnie followed with the next day. I knew they weren't reaching out to communicate, only to report their safe return and perhaps, silently, to close the door on any need for further dialogue. What haunted me most was not the absence of affection, but the implied permanence of it, that I had been quietly, officially reclassified in their minds as unsafe. And more than unsafe, irrelevant. On the third day after their departure, I received a small package in the mail. No note, no return address, just a soft yellow envelope with my name in block letters. Inside was the stuffed elephant I had bought for Madeline, the one I had placed so carefully on the coffee table. I took it out, sat down with it in my lap, and stared at its stitched smile for what must have been an hour. They had left it behind deliberately, not forgotten, rejected. And sending it back now was their way of punctuating the message. No connection, no strings. I wasn't just outside the circle. I had been erased from it. That night, I finally allowed myself to pull down the photo albums from the top shelf of my closet, the ones Helen had so lovingly curated over the decades, arranged in chronological order with neat little captions in her careful cursive. I flipped through the pages of Kevin's childhood, his first steps, his second-grade science fair, the summer camping trips, the soccer games, The birthday parties where I wore paper hats and carved cakes shaped like dinosaurs. In every photo, my arm was around him. I wasn't absent. I wasn't cold. I saw a father who was trying, who had stumbled, yes, but who had always been there. I kept turning pages, looking for evidence that would reassure me, looking for something to confirm my version of the past. I found it in a school assignment from 5th grade, preserved between 2 plastic sleeves. My dad is the smartest man I know. He always helps me with my homework. He knows about plants and space and how to fix broken fans. He makes pancakes on Sundays. I want to be like him when I grow up. I pressed the page to my chest and closed my eyes. But memory is a strange thing. What a child remembers, and what an adult comes to believe, can drift apart over time like continents. I had always told myself that grief had no shape, that it passed through people differently, unpredictably. But I had not realized that silence, when prolonged and unexplained, could be interpreted not as pain, but as distance, or worse, indifference. Kevin's grief had turned into questioning, and those questions had apparently found answers in the echo chamber of therapy, or marriage, or fear. I did not blame him entirely, but I couldn't excuse him either, not for what he allowed himself to assume, not for what he allowed himself to accuse. The breaking point came later that week. I had just finished trimming the hedges when I noticed an envelope wedged between the screen door and the frame. No postage. Someone had delivered it by hand. I opened it cautiously, hands still dirty with soil. It was a printed letter, not handwritten, formal, lawyerly. It stated that Kevin and Marnie were requesting I refrain from future contact with Madeline without prior written consent. That any further attempts to visit or communicate directly would be considered a boundary violation. That this was not a legal restraining order but a strongly worded request, made in the interest of Madeline's psychological safety and consistent caregiving environment. I read the letter 3 times. Then I went inside, washed my hands slowly, deliberately, and sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I felt nothing. Or, rather, I felt the slow onset of a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. Whatever story Kevin and Marnie had constructed about me, whether it was rooted in truth, confusion, or projection, it was now set. The concrete had dried. I was not the grandfather who would teach Madeline about stars or take her to feed ducks in the park. I was the variable to be controlled, the past to be rewritten, the threat. And yet, deep within all that devastation, something stirred. A quiet, rebellious ember, not of rage, not yet, but of resistance. If they had rewritten me in their minds, did I not also have the right to rewrite the future, to choose not to be erased, to preserve some version of truth, not just for me, but for Madeline, who might one day ask questions her parents couldn't answer honestly? That night, for the first time in years, I opened a new document on my computer and began to write. Not a letter, not a plea, a record. I wrote down everything. Dates, events, memories. I described the summers, the breakfasts, the bedtime rituals. I included the darker parts too. How I fell apart after Helen's death, how I withdrew, how I failed to see Kevin's pain. But I wrote it all. For her. For the little girl with the elephant smile who had twice crawled into my arms, not because she remembered me, but because something inside her recognized me. Because love, when it's real, doesn't wait for permission. And that is how it began. Not with revenge, not with confrontation, but with a slow, quiet declaration. I would not disappear. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a man inside a bell jar. Everything was muffled, distant, and dreamlike, yet heavy with implication. I found myself listening for sounds that never came. A child's laugh, the ring of the phone, even the creak of a car door in the driveway. None came. The stillness was a kind of echo chamber, amplifying every memory and regret until they drowned out the present. I spent hours on my computer continuing the document I'd begun, a sprawling narrative that began as a record for Madeline, but quickly evolved into something more complex. It became a confrontation with my own memory. I found myself revisiting moments not just as I remembered them, but as I imagined Kevin might have remembered them, filtered through a child's confusion, through years of emotional distance, through the lens of loss and unmet needs. I tried to be fair. I tried to be honest. But always I circled back to one fundamental question. Was there something I had missed? Something I had done, or failed to do, that could explain why the boy who once clung to my hand now flinched from my voice? I found an old box in the attic filled with Kevin's childhood drawings, school certificates, birthday cards. One card stood out, Father's Day, 1991. To the best dad in the world, it read in crooked letters. Thank you for always reading to me and fixing my toys and carrying me on your back when my legs hurt. I love you. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, then placed it carefully on my desk, as if it could anchor me to some version of reality I still needed to believe in. Then came the second letter. Unlike the first, this one was certified. Signed. Not from Kevin, from a law office in San Diego. It stated, in clinical legal language, that Kevin and Marnie were initiating a formal process to request a wellness assessment and possible guardianship review for me, citing recent disorientation, boundary violations, and emotional instability. They were not accusing me of a crime. They were not even filing for conservatorship, not yet, but they were exploring options for preemptive protective oversight of familial interactions in the best interest of the minor child. There it was, in black and white. They were laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally unfit. I sat at the kitchen table for over an hour with that letter in front of me, breathing slowly, trying to understand what I was looking at. It wasn't anger I felt. Not then. It was something colder, more crystalline. A kind of numbing disbelief that slowly thawed into the sharp realization of betrayal. They weren't just cutting me off. They were preparing to make it legal, permanent, irrefutable. They were trying to write me out of my own life, not just emotionally, but institutionally. And for what? Because I held my granddaughter when she reached for me? Because I dared to ask questions about vague insinuations they refused to clarify? Or because they simply needed a villain to justify the fortress they were building around their daughter? I called the law office, spoke to a paralegal named Dana who confirmed the letter's authenticity but said she wasn't authorized to discuss the specifics. I suggest you obtain counsel, Mr. Rouse, she said politely. It's best if everything goes through the proper legal channels. I hung up, walked to the sink, and vomited into it. Then I called a local attorney I knew distantly, Joanne Mercer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had once helped me sort out Helen's will. She met me at her office the next morning, read the letter in silence, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Have you had any recent incidents? Anything that might have prompted this? No, I said, unless holding my granddaughter when she crawled into my arms counts. She nodded slowly. It might. She explained that what Kevin and Marnie were doing was increasingly common among younger families, particularly those with inherited trauma or trust issues. They weren't accusing me of abuse, not directly, but they were invoking the language of emotional safeguarding, using the language of therapy as legal ammunition. They're framing this as proactive, she said, which means they don't need evidence. Just concern, just enough suggestion to trigger a review process. And what happens if they succeed? You'd be required to undergo psychological evaluations, possibly have a temporary guardian appointed for certain decisions, Depending on the findings, it could affect your legal independence. And access to Madeline. She looked at me with grim kindness. That's already gone, Gerald. I sat in her office, staring out the window at a row of brittle palm trees, and realized how thoroughly the ground beneath me had shifted. I had gone from a man trying to reconnect with his family to someone being quietly dismantled by that same family. They weren't just rewriting my story. They were planning to have it redacted. It didn't take long for word to spread. I live in a small community, retirees mostly, with long memories and short tempers. Joanne had barely filed a preliminary response to the wellness inquiry before the whispers started. At the grocery store, I noticed the cashier avoided eye contact. At the community center, a woman I'd played chess with for years excused herself mid-game and didn't return. Even my neighbor Carl, who once helped me install a new sprinkler line, waved less often, his face tight with politeness. I considered leaving, selling the house, moving somewhere new where no one knew me. But then I remembered the box of drawings upstairs, the photo albums, the Father's Day card, and I knew I couldn't run. Not because I was proud, but because I had something to prove. Not just to Kevin, to myself. Joanne advised me to request an independent evaluation. Beat them to it, she said. It'll make you look proactive, lucid, and confident. So I did. I scheduled appointments with 2 different geriatric specialists and 1 clinical psychologist. All of them found me mentally sound, mildly depressed, emotionally stable. No signs of dementia. No indication of cognitive decline. I forwarded the reports to Joanne, who included them in our formal response. We didn't accuse Kevin and Marnie of malice. We simply rebutted their claims with evidence. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. The silence from their end was deafening. Weeks passed. No calls, no letters, no response from their lawyer. Joanne said it was a good sign. It meant they were probably backing down. But it didn't feel like retreat. It felt like exile. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. I received a letter, not from a lawyer, but from Marnie. Handwritten, neat slanted script on cream stationery, no return address. She wrote that Kevin had been in therapy for years and that some of his memories were fragmented but vivid. She didn't specify what those memories were, only that they involved emotional neglect, coldness, and a prolonged period of unsafe tension. She said she didn't believe Kevin was lying, but she didn't know if what he remembered was real in the way memories sometimes aren't. She admitted that she didn't know what to believe anymore, but she said that watching me with Madeline had unsettled something in her, not in a bad way, but in a way she hadn't expected. She said Madeline clearly felt drawn to me, that she had reached for me with joy, not fear, that this confused her, that she didn't know what to do with that confusion. She ended the letter with a simple line. Maybe someday she'll ask about you. I don't know what I'll say, but I won't lie, I read the letter 6 times. Then I placed it inside the same box as the Father's Day card and the elephant. Not because it was hopeful, but because it was honest. Because it didn't pretend to be final. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without waking. It was nearly 2 months after receiving Marnie's letter when the unexpected finally happened. I was standing in the garden, pruning the rosemary bush that had overgrown its terracotta pot, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming. The sound, so ordinary and mundane, froze me in place. I looked up and saw Kevin's car parked unevenly in the gravel, half shadowed by the old oak tree at the edge of the driveway. He stepped out alone. No child seat in the back, no Marnie by his side. Just a man in a wrinkled shirt and dark sunglasses who looked like he hadn't slept in several days. I stood there with the shears in my hand, unsure whether to speak first or let him. The last time I'd seen his face, it had been twisted in a mask of disbelief and something close to revulsion. Now, his expression was unreadable, Tired, yes, but also burdened, as if he were carrying more weight than even he understood. He walked toward me without saying anything, stopping just a few feet away, his eyes darting once toward the garden bench and then back to mine. "Can we sit?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I nodded and led him to the bench without a word. The rosemary in my hand still smelled fresh, sharp, alive. We sat in silence for a long time. The wind rustled the dry leaves, the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower filled the gaps between our breaths, and the garden, once so comforting in its quiet routine, now felt like a stage waiting for a confession. Kevin leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. "I don't know where to begin," he said finally. I didn't respond. I wasn't going to rescue him from the burden of honesty. Not this time. "I got your letters," he continued. "The ones you wrote to her. To Madeline. Marnie found them on your computer. I guess she opened the file when things were happening." My stomach turned, but I stayed still. "She read every word," he said. "Then she printed them out and gave them to me. She said, 'I think you should read this when you're ready.'" His fingers clenched and unclenched. "I wasn't ready," he said, almost laughing. "I read them anyway. All of them. Took me 3 nights. The garden felt smaller somehow, the air pressing tighter around us. I watched him shift, search for a way to speak what clearly terrified him. "I remember things," he said. "Strange, disjointed things. Mom crying in the hallway. You sitting in the dark. You forgetting to pick me up from practice once. I told my therapist that meant something, that it proved something. But then I read what you wrote, how you described those days. Your grief, the silence, the fear of breaking in front of me, and it didn't add up, not like I thought it did. It made me realize I built a story around absence, around what I didn't understand. Around silence." He finally looked at me then, and his face, for all its lines and shadows, looked more like the boy I remembered than the man I had come to fear. "And I'm sorry," he said, "for everything. For what we accused you of. For what we almost did. The words should have brought relief, but they didn't. Not fully. They hung in the air like smoke, visible, real, but still choking. I looked down at my hands, still stained with rosemary, still shaking slightly. "You said you almost did something," I murmured. "What does that mean?" Kevin swallowed hard. "We filed for temporary observation. We had plans. If the evaluations hadn't gone the way they did, we would have petitioned the court. We had the documents drafted." He paused. "I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I was protecting her. My daughter." That word hit like a drum. Daughter, not granddaughter, not mine, his. I nodded slowly, letting the bitterness pass through me without anchoring itself. "She's not broken," I said. "She's not unsafe. She's not confused. She saw me and came to me. Twice. Before anything was said. Before anyone taught her how to be afraid of me." Kevin lowered his head. "I know," he whispered. "That's what scared me most." We sat in silence again. Somewhere behind us a bird sang once and then stopped. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I wouldn't if I were you." I inhaled deeply, felt the sharp scent of rosemary burn the inside of my nose. "Forgiveness," I said, "isn't the problem. Memory is." Kevin looked at me sideways. "What do you mean?" "I mean your version of me has been broken for years," I replied. "Maybe since you were 12, maybe since your mother died. And I didn't fight that. I let you grow into that silence, thinking I was sparing you grief, when really I was just giving you space to fill in the blanks with whatever your pain needed." I turned toward him, my voice steadier than I expected. "I loved you the best way I knew how. Maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe it wasn't loud enough or soft enough or strong enough. but it was real. And it still is. His eyes welled up then, but he didn't cry. He just nodded, slowly, his mouth pulled into something like a grimace. "I thought I'd feel lighter," he said, saying it. Admitting I was wrong. "But I don't. You won't," I told him. "Not right away." He stood after that, brushing his hands against his jeans. "Marnie and I are going to therapy. Together. She wants to see you again. Eventually. She said she wasn't ready to face you if I wasn't." I didn't say anything. I didn't trust words just yet. "Madeline still asks about the man with the beard," he added. "She holds that elephant toy every night, even when we tried to replace it with something new." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "She named it Rue." I let myself smile then, just slightly. Not from pride, but recognition. That something remained. Something small, but unsinkable. Kevin looked around the garden. "You've kept everything so tidy," he said. "It's exactly like I remember it." "I kept it the same," I said, "because I didn't want to forget how things once were." "Even when you did." He looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen in decades. Earnest, wounded, but open. "Would you? Would you want to come visit sometime? Just for lunch. Nothing complicated." "Not yet," I replied gently. "Maybe soon." "But not yet." He nodded, accepting that. "I'll call you." "I know," I said. And I did. For the first time in a long time, I believed him. He turned, walked back to the car. No hug, no dramatics. Just a glance over the shoulder that said everything his mouth couldn't yet manage. When he drove away, the wind picked up, rustling the garden like a sigh. I stood there for a long while, hands in my pockets, eyes fixed on the empty driveway. It wasn't reconciliation, not fully. But it was something closer to truth than I had dared to hope for. A crack in the ice, a hand reaching through the fog. And, for now, that was enough. It has been 7 months since that afternoon in the garden. 7 months since Kevin sat beside me, unspooling the tangle of our history with trembling hands and unsteady breath. In that time, much has remained unchanged. The house is still mine alone. The sun still cuts its familiar path across the adobe walls each morning, and I still make my oatmeal with cinnamon, even though the taste feels thinner now. But something quiet and fundamental has shifted, something in the gravity of each day. Not lighter, exactly, but more stable, as if a center of mass that had long drifted finally settled back into place. Kevin calls now, sometimes twice a week. Not with apologies or explanations, but with stories. About work, about Marnie's new obsession with succulents, about the way Madeline says spaghetti, like bascadee. It's not warmth yet, not the fluid closeness we once had, but it's real. And it grows by increments. He asks about my health. I don't lie anymore. When my left knee stiffens or the stove knob slips in my grip, I tell him. Not to guilt him, just to be known. Marnie sent her own message 2 months ago. A voice memo, not a letter. In it, she said she had reread my writings, my long ramble to Madeline, the confessional journal I never meant to share. She said she'd cried reading it, not out of guilt, but recognition. She admitted she had judged me too quickly, that she had projected her own father's failures onto my silence. She said she still didn't know how to be comfortable around me, but that she no longer felt afraid. That part mattered more than she probably realized. Fear is a wall, but discomfort is a door. You can walk through it if you choose. Last week, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a drawing, a crayon scrawl in red and yellow, a figure with a beard holding hands with a small girl in a pink dress. On the back, in Marnie's handwriting, Madeline says this is Rue and the man who gave him. I stared at that drawing for a long time. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was proof. Children don't lie when they draw. They just reflect what they feel. And what Madeline felt, at least once, was connection. I keep the drawing beside the Father's Day card and the elephant. They sit now in a wooden box in my study, along with a new letter I've started writing. Not to Kevin, not even to Madeline, but to myself. A kind of private testimony. A record of what has survived. Not triumph, not vindication, but clarity. I know now that the worst wound wasn't the accusation. It was the silence that followed it. The erasure. The vacuum. And yet, somehow, that silence became the womb of something else. A return. A reckoning. Maybe even a chance. I haven't seen Madeline again. Not yet. Kevin says soon, maybe this fall. They want to come to Sedona again. Just a weekend. We'll stay at a hotel, he said, but maybe we could meet you at the park. She remembers the orange trees. I said I'd bring sandwiches. That, I'd bring Rue. I didn't ask for more. I've learned not to reach too far, not to grasp too hard. The things that are real will find their way back in time, or they won't. But I'll remain. I'll be here, not waiting in grief or anger, but grounded, present. There are days when the bitterness returns, quietly, like fog rolling in. Days when I think of the months they nearly took from me, the judgments they wrote into the bones of the legal system, the things they believed without ever daring to ask me directly. But those days pass more quickly now. They lose their grip sooner, because bitterness has nothing to hold on to when truth stands firm. I know who I was. I know what I did. I know the mistakes I made. And I know I am not the man they once imagined in fear. I am the man a little girl once reached for. Twice, unprompted. I am the man who wrote his story down not out of pride, but out of hope. The garden is in bloom now. The rosemary has rebounded. The lemon tree, Helen's tree, has begun to bud again after years of silence. I take my coffee there in the mornings, sit with my thoughts, and watch the light change over the stones. Sometimes I imagine Madeline at 5, running through the yard, picking flowers I told her not to. I imagine her finding the old swing Kevin once built and asking what it's for. I imagine telling her the truth, that it was for her father, once upon a time, before all the forgetting began. If they never return, if that weekend never comes, I'll still be here. Not waiting, but witnessing. Because some stories don't need an ending to feel complete. They only need to be told with honesty and kept alive in the hearts of those brave enough to remember them.